This is Headnotes, a podcast from Whitehead Monckton.
Hi everyone, so my name's Emma Palmer. I'm a family lawyer here at Whitehead Monckton, and I have a practice in collaborative law and in the very new concept, one lawyer, one client, and two clients. And I'm here today with Simon O'Connell, who's from Evelyn Partners and who is a financial planner. Simon, do you want to tell everyone a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, hi Emma. So I'm Simon O'Connell. I'm a chartered financial planner at Evelyn Partners. I give advice to clients mainly on divorce. I head up the family and divorce team across the south, sort of from Kent across to sort of Bristol, Cardiff area. And so most of my work is on sort of dealing with family clients.
Fantastic. So, Simon, technically pension's not necessarily the sexiest of subjects, but as you know, I'm hugely passionate about pensions. I see them as being a real facilitator for clients, and ironically, they're often one of the most valuable assets in a marriage, particularly for those couples later on in life. We thought we'd try and give a bit of a whistle-top tour through pensions. So can I ask you to try and explain in easy terms for the audience to understand the different types of pensions that we have?
Yeah, so I suppose really there's two main types. So the first thing, one is called a defined benefit, and that is mainly the public sector, so things like NHS, teachers, armed forces, police, that type of thing, where you get your service and your salary. So it's a guaranteed benefit. You know what you're going to get, based on your salary and how long you work there. You can work out what your final pension will be in retirement. The other one is a defined contribution, where you put your money in, and it's normally through an insurance company or an investment company. So you pay your contributions, you invest in something, but there's no certainty. You don't know what you're going to get out at retirement. So that's really the two main types.
And then in terms of the orders a court can make, then obviously that's something that I see all the time, and you're obviously helping in a way to advise on. We've broadly speaking got pension sharing orders, we've got pension attachment orders, and we've got offsetting. And I think the easiest way to explain a pension sharing order is to say that effectively one person's pension, a percentage of that is taken out and transferred by a court order to another person's pension. Earmarking, we don't really see many of them anymore, do we?
Not really. No, I haven't seen one for a long time.
No, I mean, that used to be pre the kind of pension sharing order coming in, that was the only way to make an order against someone's pension. But I remember back in the day when I started out, before we had pension sharing orders, it was quite unreliable, because obviously you earmarked a percentage of the person's pension in retirement, but if they stopped paying into it, then you could basically not get what you thought you were going to get. And obviously if they died, it ended, whereas pension sharing orders, in their own right, sort of changed everything, didn't they? Yeah,
it's effectively a clean break, isn't it? Because you're separating the pension, you're giving each person their own pension, so it becomes fair. And then depends, but that means that different people can retire at different ages. They might take a different type of pension when they get to retirement. It all depends on their health, their age, what they're looking to do, their other income.
And then offsetting, again, a little bit sort of, less likely to be used these days, but still a kind of valuable tool in our book to use. What's your view on them so far? Yeah,
so we try and avoid offsetting where we can. The problem is some people want, for example, more of the house or more of other assets rather than the pension. So it's understandable, but what you're doing is you're trading an income in retirement for a capital asset. And so they're not the same thing. So trying to value a house as against an income in retirement, but they're not like for like. And that's one of the problems that's happened over the years, is people haven't really valued how much is one against the other, and how do you value a future income as against a house or cash or an investment. So it's one of the difficulties, is they're not like for like. We've always called it apples and pears. You're not comparing the same things.
And it's possible then to actually come off worse, isn't it, in a way, if you take the offset rather than the pension, particularly with defined benefit schemes, which are very valuable.
Yeah, and the other problem is, and it's often been the women that have wanted to stay in the house, but then they have a poor retirement, because you often have one person who's got a lot of pension, and they can go off, maybe they're a higher earner, they go off and they buy another house and they carry on, then they have a nice retirement, and the person who stays in the house maybe hasn't got such earnings capacity, but then when they get to retirement, they're going to have a poor retirement because their pension is a lot lower. So they don't think of the future.
Still a valid option, but perhaps something to be a bit cautious about from a financial planner's perspective.
You always have to think about what you're giving up and what you're gaining, really, and is that the right? Sometimes they don't have an alternative. Sometimes they need to stay in the house, might have young children. Sometimes there's not enough other money to share. So sometimes it's a needs must. You can give people the options and then they can decide what is the most suitable for them.
So the biggest change really in pensions in the last few years has been the introduction of PAG. That from my perspective, PAG, it's amazing. It's changed the way that we look at pensions on divorce. And for the audience, PAG is the pension advisory group. I always describe this to clients as being sort of like the sort of top barristers, lawyers who got together with pension experts, judges, financial planners, and sort of produced a manual for how pensions on divorce should be looked at. What would you say were the top tips from PAG for family lawyers?
Yeah, so certainly the equality of income. That's one area where it's fairer to share income in retirement. Offsetting, it's basically a manual for everything. It's about nearly 200 pages, so there's about 16 chapters. So I did go through when it first came out and spent a couple of weeks reading through it all and being a pensions nerd and trying to understand it, but then trying to translate that for family lawyers, for mediators, for barristers and judges to actually understand what does it really mean, because no one really wants to wade through 200 pages. So unless you're a pensions geek, so then trying to make it more user-friendly, to direct people to say, this is a headline, this is what you need to think about, and this is the page to go to find out a bit more information if you want, or ask someone if you're not sure. So yeah, it's been a really helpful guide, and people then do refer to it a lot because it's got a lot of information, and it's just evolved over time. Really, we had PAG 1, and then about 5 years later there was a review, and then we had COVID, so it was really just reviewing what lessons did we learn from the first review, and then they had another whole, some of the people from PAG 1 and then went into PAG 2, and then what were the learning things, what have been the court cases since, what's changed since then.
And some really useful kind of appendices at the back with sort of precedents and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I usually say to clients, feel free to read it if you really, really have nothing better to do.
Yeah.
But for me, the headlines are that where pension funds are a combined value of over 100,000, especially if they've got those defined benefit schemes you were talking about at the beginning, so NHS, teachers, armed forces, you should be instructing a pension on divorce expert, which we call PODE.
Yeah.
For those out there, a PODE is a pension on divorce expert, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a sec, aren't we?
Yeah.
So that was one of them. The other one was that we should be looking to achieve equality of income in retirement, which you've already mentioned, Simon, rather than equality of capital.
Yeah.
That we should also be avoiding offsetting. Again, we've talked about that a little bit. So looking at having a house instead of a pension in most cases, if we can. And then the big one, I think, which changed a lot from a family lawyer's perspective, was the idea that premarital and post-separation contributions to pensions should only really be ring-fenced and put to one side in the rarest of cases, usually where there's need. So those people with fabulous amounts of pensions, not people like us.
The general public, normally it's a needs case, isn't it? Normally they need the pension, not unless they're particularly wealthy and they can just share it without any real detriment to their lifestyle, really. So it's not going to affect their current
and there aren't
future.
That many of those kind of cases.
Not many. You come across a few. But I think too many people try and pin it down. They say, well, I had a year here or 2 years here where I paid in and they didn't. So, but the judges don't accept that. They say you don't part share a house, you don't part share cash or investment, so you shouldn't part share a pension. So a lot of people ask for it, but it's generally not accepted in exceptional cases.
And that's quite a big change that PAG brought in, isn't it, that one? So that moves us sort of neatly on to talking about what a pension on divorce expert is. And obviously that's something you can tell the audience about.
Yeah, so a pension on divorce expert is trying to understand what the pensions are, looking under the bonnet as to what, is it a defined benefit, is it a defined contribution? And sometimes you find these odd hybrids where you get a defined contribution with a defined benefit underpin. You might get the best of both worlds. There might be some guarantees in there that you're not aware of. And most clients don't really know what to look for or what these mean. Sometimes it's a one-liner in a long document that you have to sort of wade through and find out. So what a pension on divorce expert does is they write to the schemes, they get the correct information, they then work through it, and then there's two things what they're trying to do is one, how much should you share? So what is the combined value, and then how do you share that equally between both parties, normally on an equality of income basis? And then the other thing is, then where do you take that money from? So if one person's got, say, 4 pensions, how do they share it? Do they share it from 1 or do they share it from 2? So it's 2 things. One is how much they share, and then where do they share it from? That's quite key.
And actually, that's a really interesting point, because I've had clients come in before that have said, well, I should have half of each of those pensions.
Yeah.
And then getting them to understand, actually, that's not necessarily the most cost-effective way of doing it.
No.
Sometimes the pensions have different benefits. There's costs involved in pension sharing orders being done. So, it could be quite common to just choose, say, one pension to make the order against, which combines all of the totals.
Yeah, and it's normally, so the person getting the money often doesn't really care where it comes from. It doesn't really matter to the person receiving the money. It makes a big difference to the person giving up the money. So if they've got, for example, defined benefit, they've got a guaranteed income in retirement, and that's normally more valuable. So the normal way you start off with is you'd normally share the defined contribution first, because you're trying to destroy the least value. Because if you share the wrong thing, you can end up with less value combined than you would where you started. So, if you've got a combined value of 20,000 a year income, and then you share it, you might end up with 18,000 because you've destroyed some of that value. So it doesn't benefit either party. So you want to try and preserve as much value as you can out of the pots. Actually,
one of the things that we could pick up on quickly is there's been a lot of press, obviously, and some clients will have seen this, about McLeod and the effect of that on defined benefit pension schemes, public sector ones in the main. Tell the audience a little bit about what McLeod was and what it's done.
Oh, that's a can of worms. So it's basically age discrimination. So it's where people get into retirement. The government announced back in about 2014 that they could people could work later. And then what happened is they came out of one scheme. They then set up something called mainly called the career average scheme. But if you were within 10 years of retirement, you could be in the old scheme still, because it was deemed to be better. The problem is that then other younger people said, well, hang on, that's discriminating on age. If you were sort of 50 and over, generally you got left in one scheme. If you were younger than a certain age, you then came out of it and then went into the scheme that was perceived to be of less value. And that went to court and basically said, yeah, it is age discrimination. So what happens now is people are in 2 schemes, but then you get the benefit of either one. So as you when you get to retirement, they say, here's option A, here's option B, which one do you want? And it's usually reasonably obvious, because one is better than the other. You get a higher pension and a higher lump sum, or you might get a higher pension and a lower lump sum, and you just have to work out which is better for that person based on their age and their health. But it's complicated, but it's easy in the fact, from a client's point of view, you just get 2 options and you just choose one or the other.
And I think they seem to have caught up in the main now, don't they, with the backlog of because we had a period of time a couple of years ago where it was taking forever to get values out of the pension companies because they were sort of midway between doing those calcs.
Yeah, the main problem is that you're trying to calculate 2 different types of schemes for millions of members. When you think how big the NHS is, and the civil service and the teachers, the armed forces, they are the bulk of the population. So you had a few number of people calculating millions of calculations, and it's really complex. And there just wasn't enough people around to be able to do all these calculations. So it's taken a long time. And then each the civil service is different to the NHS, and the NHS is different to the teachers. So the on paper they look similar, they've all got different rules, and they're all run by different people. Yeah. So that's where it became quite complicated. Yeah. But I think we've got through most of that now.
It seems that way. It seems to be catching up. So the obvious question that people are probably going to ask is, well, okay, it sounds like I might need a pension on divorce expert, a PODE. How do I go about getting that? And how do I achieve that?
Yeah. So pension on divorce expert has to be instructed, and we can talk about letter of instruction in a minute. But so you need to ask someone to do some calculations for you. So pension on divorce expert, they were mainly called actuaries in the past, but the reason the pension on divorce expert name came about is because in PAG 2, one of the leading judges said we need to come up with a name that incorporates other people. We can't just call them actuarial reports, because there are non-actuaries doing the reports. So that's where the name came from.
That was where the name came from. Yeah. I always wondered.
So it's one of the co-chair of PAG came up with this name, and not everyone likes it, but pension on divorce expert says what it does what it says on the tin. So it's sort of reasonably obvious. So there's a difference between, you've got some financial planners who do it, but they're generally not financial planners. They're out, they're sort of back office people that would do the calculations and not out giving advice. So a pension on divorce expert has to be neutral, really. So they're given an instruction. So this is what we want. We want equality of income at a certain age, or we want offsetting. And they're looking at, so they're writing to the schemes, getting the information, and then they're deciding how best to share those fairly between the couple without any influence on the couple. And also they don't know anything about the background of the couple, what house they've got, what other assets they've got. They're literally just doing the number crunching for the pensions based on what you give them. So you've got to give them a good instruction, because obviously if you give a bad instruction or it favours one person or the other, that's what you get back. They're not going to ring you up and say, "Are you sure you want this?" because, it favours a husband or wife. You say, well, you instruct them. That's what you're going to get back.
Yeah, so it's about telling them the right things to get that get the answers that you need for the couple. That's the key
thing, yeah. We all say rubbish in, rubbish out. If you ask for a bad instruction, you'll get a bad answer. And it won't. And then sometimes it might suit one party more than the other. So it's offering it's writing a fair instruction to get a fair outcome. That's what.
And I suppose it's fair to say that in most cases, clients will come to a lawyer like me to help them to identify a pension on divorce expert to use, and then to help them with that letter of instruction. But it is possible, is it not, for clients, if they want to go directly to pension on divorce expert? Some companies will do that.
Some will do it. The problem is that they're dealing with people who don't understand what their pensions are, and then they won't know what to ask. So that is difficult. And it's quite a small industry. There's not many pension on divorce experts, not many firms that do it. It's quite a small group of people. They'll work roughly the same. They'll charge roughly the same. There's not a great deal of difference. What we have found is there's a few more people trying to offer it. So there's been a few more other firms coming into the market. And also we're trying to work out, do you need a PODE? So although PAG does say there are certain criteria, I've had some where they've been £1 million plus, and you would say, well, that definitely ticks a box of needing a PODE, but actually you don't. Sometimes they might be the same age and they might have similar pensions. So what are you really trying to achieve? Yeah. You've got people that are at or near retirement, and again, they might have different views, but sometimes you just add it up divided by 2. So I've seen some where people have gone to a PODE, got it back, and you go, well, I hasn't really achieved anything. I haven't got anything more than I could have just done by adding it up and dividing it. So you've got to understand what the pensions are. Do you need one? So some of the work we've been doing is sort of triaging cases to say, rather than going straight to a PODE, and then what I know a lot of solicitors do is say, we'll go and ask 3 different experts to quote, and then we'll get them, and often people just choose the cheapest one. I mean, it's hard to determine which is going to be better. So they're all doing roughly the same thing because they're all following the same rules. So yeah, it's do you need a PODE in the first place? We're getting more questions on.
And I think that comes actually off the back of, there's been quite a lot of sort of media about that, hasn't there? That PAG coming in, every single family lawyer suddenly said, okay, tick box, 100,000.
Yeah.
Okay, we must have a PODE report.
Yeah.
And actually now more recently, people have been saying, well, hold on a minute, as you say, if you've got a couple who've got exactly the same type of fund and it's exactly the same value,
age,
it might well be over 100,000, but what do you need a PODE for? And that's where someone like you comes in and assists firms like mine with being able to advise clients in this particular case. Do you need to have a PODE report? Yeah,
I think that's big. And also, if you're spending, £2,500-3,000 on a report that no one really wants and understands anyway, you end up with a nice 30-page report that only someone like me will understand. So then you ring me up and ask me to explain what it means. So you get clients asking for reports they don't really want to pay for, that they don't really understand. And so the first thing is, do we need a report? And then how do we set the criteria to be quite narrow so it saves money? Because I think historically people have just sort of thrown everything at it and said, let's ask for everything. Let's ask for multiple ages and multiple options.
I've seen that.
And then you end up with 8 different calculations, which no one really understands. And it just becomes more complicated because obviously one side wants to save money by going for the cheapest version, and someone else wants to go for the highest amount. And then you end up some compromise in the middle. So it's easier often, particularly in things like mediation, to agree the format and agree what is it you're actually looking for. When are you both likely to retire? And then agree that, and then just ask for one thing that they can both agree on. Keep it simple. I think people have overcomplicated it over the years, and no one really understands what the result is. So
no, absolutely no. You're quite right, and I think that for me, that's how I've always worked with clients: is just try and keep it as simple as possible, so that everybody understands what they're doing. Absolutely. So we talked a little bit about offsetting earlier. How would you go about doing an offsetting calculation? I mean, back in the day, there used to be sort of like you discount a bit here and a bit there. But if you were offsetting in a case, say the client definitively wanted to do that, how do you do those calculations as a financial planner?
Yeah, I mean, there's no easy way. What a PODE would have previously done, and would normally do, is actually do the equality of income first and then work out what is an offset from that equality, because you've got to actually be able to do one calculation. You can't do one on its own very easily. You could probably do it if you've only got money purchased, so a defined contribution, where you've got known values and there's no complications. You could add it up and say, well, okay, there's the difference, then you take off a bit of tax. So what we normally assume, if they're not retired, you assume that the person who's got the pension is going to take 25% tax-free cash, and then when they retire, they'll be a basic rate taxpayer. So the calculation is we normally take off 15% for tax for a basic rate taxpayer and 30% for a high rate taxpayer. That's a sort of simple calculation, and that's probably oversimplifying it, but you can do that if you've got, let's say you've got one person who's got £100,000 pot and the other person's got no pension, and they want to. So offsetting means that both people keep the pensions that they've got, but one person's got more pension than the other. So how do you come to a compromise to say, well, if I want more of the house and you keep the pension, how do we do that? So the problem is when you've got multiple pensions and you've got defined benefit and defined contribution, adding up, and there isn't a simple answer to that. It does become a bit more complicated, which is why you often have to get the PODEs to do the calculations and ask for an offsetting in addition. In addition to the work that you're already doing.
That's what I would do in those situations usually, and generally with clients, I'm sort of saying, I would recommend equality of income. That's what PAG tells us. But if they're absolutely adamant, then we might ask as an additional for the offsetting calc.
Yeah, because they sort of need to know what they're giving up and what they're attaining, aren't they? And what does it mean to them? So one of the benefits of the PODE is it tells you what the income in retirement might look like. So that's useful from a financial planning point of view, because if you can say to someone, right, when you retire, you're going to get X amount of pension, is that enough to live on? So it's a sort of, the PODE isn't giving financial planning advice, but the PODE report is really useful to give financial planning off the back of it, because it gives you a lot of answers that says, this is when you're looking to retire, this is the type of income that you might get. So it's just helpful to have that level of information.
And that's something that someone like your firm can really help with, where you can sit down and model somebody's retirement, can't you, if you've got that sort of information? Yeah,
and then also, then what do you do when you get to retirement? So we're finding a lot of people are either sort of mid-50s and older, so they're sort of at the age where they've either retired or they're just about to come up to retirement. And they're saying, well, I'm going to get a pot of money, but what do I actually do with it? It's all right saying I'm going to get 50% of something, but I don't know what 50% is, and I don't know what I'm going to get, and I don't know what to do with it when I get it. And so then you can talk to them about, do you need a guaranteed income? So the two options really for retirement are an annuity, which is just buying a guaranteed income for the rest of your life. And there's a number of different options, but that's just, particularly for the weaker party who's never really had any involvement and doesn't want any investment advice, just buying an annuity is quite straightforward. It's an income for the rest of your life. You can buy a level one, or you can buy an index where it will go up. So we talk to them about what sort of level of income you need and how much money would that cost to buy that income. And the other option is what's called an income drawdown, where you effectively draw down on it, but you still have to take some investment risk. And that's the problem, is if you don't manage that properly, you might either be too high risk, you might be too low risk, you might strip it out too quickly. And I think the stats show that if people do their own income drawdown, they tend to run out of money about 5 years before life expectancy.
Oh no, that's not good.
And that's the problem. So where you've got an advisor, you're very conscious of how long they might live, and then making sure they model that through their lifetime. If they do it themselves, they often run out of money too quick. They spend it too quickly, thinking I'm living for now and not for in my 80s. And then they get to their 80s and they're still living, and they're thinking, oh, now I've run out of money. So that
no one needs that.
No, so that's a problem, of course. And you're not working then, are you? So you can't then create any more. You can't create any more money.
So that's really one of the main things that a financial planner like yourself can do, is to model somebody's future and then help them to manage the investment they might get through a divorce that I might help them with to live.
That's the key thing, really. It's always the person who's getting the money. So what am I actually doing with it? And actually we find often the person giving away the money wants to make sure the person getting it is going to make sense of it, going to do something sensible with it. Because often if you have money left when you die, that might then go on to children or grandchildren. So it's still family money at the end of the day. It might go from husband or wife to husband, or one partner to the other. But ultimately, that might then go down through other generations. So
yes, and that's true actually. With non-defined benefit pensions, you can still, can't you, make provision for your children and other family members?
Yeah. So what happens on a married couple? You usually leave it to your spouse, and then if the spouse doesn't spend it all, they might have rental property, or they might have other assets. Then they might decide to leave their pension to to family members, so it might pass down generations. But obviously, if you then get divorced, you've only got yourself effectively. But then what are you going to do with that money? They still want their children or their grandchildren to benefit from it.
Absolutely. So we've got our PODE report now, and kind of to a certain extent, I would then bring in somebody like you perhaps to help me with that, to give me some advice on that, to perhaps speak to the client about how that might look. And then my next job would be to get that into the court order. So for the sake of the audience, it's quite a lot of stages, isn't there? So we've collated our values of our pensions. We've drafted our letter of instruction to our PODE. Yeah. We've hopefully got our PODE report back, and you've hopefully given some input, or someone like you has, into what that means. And then the next step is to get that into a court order, which is where somebody like me comes back in again, don't they? So what we then do is we have the consent order, or the court order, which deals with your financial remedy claims that you can make, and the orders that the court can make. And the court order itself will include a pension sharing order. It's a relatively standard clause that's been drafted in the past by the president of the Family Law Division. And then we have the annexes that go with that. And I always describe to clients the annexes being a bit like the actual forms that help the pension provider to do the actual pension sharing order.
Yeah, it's basically their instruction to say, you've got to share this amount with this person now, and then implement it. And
actually, you can have, as we talked about earlier, didn't we, about having more than one pension sharing order, then you can have more than one pension. So the pension, the court order itself will only have the one pension sharing order in it, but there may be a number of annexes to, quite often I find it with things like NHS, you might have the 1995 scheme and the 2015 scheme with orders against both of them, and therefore you have two annexes. And so your court order might refer to two separate references, and then the annexes will have the different details, and you can have different percentages, can't you?
Yeah, they're different parts of the scheme.
That's important for us to explain, actually, isn't it? About how the calculation that you get will always be a percentage, and you might want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's because it creates fairness whether the values go up or down, because if you get a percentage and it goes down, both parties still end up with a lower value, or if it goes up, both parties have ended up with a higher value. So the problem that was in the past, if you wrote it and said, you're going to get X amount of pound, if the value goes up, then one person loses out. So you can't define it by an actual pound, you have to do it as a percentage of the pension, because it then gets revalued. So you do all the work up front, you agree it. We call it's a moving target, because you never know the exact amount until the day that it gets transferred out. And because there's a window of the work we do, the work you do, it then goes to the court to sign it off. And it's important just to note that you have to have a court order to share a pension. You can't do it yourself. You have to get someone to actually do the court order. And it's true that you don't have to appear in court yourself, do you? I think people worry about going to court. It's just the court signing it off, basically.
Yeah. I mean, if you've come to an agreement yourselves, perhaps you've had the PODE report done, you've now agreed what pension sharing order is going to be made, then it's a drafting exercise, and then it's a paper exercise. In fact, it's not even paper anymore. It goes through a portal. It's all online. And clients find that really tricky sometimes. They say, well, where's my paper order? Well, you don't get one anymore. It's an emailed copy. But the time frames are quite interesting. I've had clients in the past say to me, why, the pension sharing report said X, but why is it a percentage? And I think you've explained that really well. But the other one is the timeframes. Yeah. So, from the minute you have your agreement, as you said, we have to, I draft up an order, I draft up some annexes. Then we have to send those to the pension company to agree, because it isn't impossible to have got something wrong. And if you've got it wrong and then the court makes it an order, then they won't implement it.
Yeah, so, and then you can't unwind it, because it's almost impossible to unwind a pension share order once it's been agreed.
You have to try and amend it, which is
very difficult,
very, very stressful. And then they have a set number of days to come back and say, are they happy with it or not? Yeah. And then hopefully they do. Then it goes off to the court, and then it could be in the court process for days, weeks, months, depending on the backlogs. And then when it comes back from the court, then there's still more waiting, because you have to wait 28 days before you can apply for your final order on the divorce. And it's only then that the pension sharing orders take effect.
Well, it doesn't even take effect then. I mean, the clock starts, but the pension company's got 4 months when they get all of the paperwork. Yep. And what most people misunderstand, and we see that often, the person who gets the court order thinks, I've got a piece of paper, the magic pension fairy is just going to sort this out for me. It will just happen. And then what actually happens is the person who's giving the money away, the scheme will write to the person and say, you're going to get some money, where do you want it to go to? Now, they've got to put it somewhere. So have they got a pension that they can top it up? A lot of companies won't. If they've got an old company scheme, they won't take it. So then do they have to set up a new pension to then take it? And then when they get the new pension, where do they invest it? So one of the problems is that each pension company's got to write to each other and sign each other's forms because it's a legal document and they've got to know it's come from a pension that's approved and it's got to go to a pension that's approved. So that's one thing. But then also the people really need advice. A person getting the money needs advice as to what they're going to do with it. Because it's not saying, here's a piece of paper, you're going to get 50% of something. That person's then got to do something with it and they've got to fill a form in. So where's that going to go? And so the problem is that people leave it till quite late down the line and then right at that stage go, what do I do with it? And that the clock's already ticking then because the scheme can't implement it until 4 months. They've got to do it within 4 months of when all the paperwork's in. So if they've even started the paperwork and they don't know where it's going to go, and then they come to someone like us, we have to start from scratch because we don't know them. And then we have to onboard them as a client, understand what they're looking for, when they're going to retire, what their risk profile is. That whole process can take us a couple of months. And then they finally get the application forms to send off. And at that stage, the scheme has then got 4 months. So from the day that you've signed it off and they come to you and go, brilliant, we've got the pension sharing annex and the order, happy days, we can easily add another 5, 6, 7, 8 months on. I'm dealing with some cases from 18 months ago where, we started the conversation. It took a year to get through the court because the couple couldn't agree and whatever. And then it's taken another 6 to 12 months for the money to land in their pension account. And they don't realise that. And one of the things we found is that clients say, well, I checked out then. I spent all my time with my lawyers and, I've got through it and I'm in happy days, I've moved on, I've bought another house, whatever. And now we're adding another 6 months onto that process. But they've mentally checked out. They said, I thought, well, this is all done. I've got the court order. I've got my piece of paper. Happy days. And they don't realise it's actually still there. They're then responsible for then taking the money and doing something with it. And
actually, ironically, I've found in my career that it's generally the person who's going to receive the money that then holds everything up.
Yeah.
Quite
ironically,
often ironically, because they fought really hard to get this pension sharing order.
And they think it's done.
You think it's done. And then you find yourself sort of, I quite often will obviously have deadlines and sort of diary reminders to check on it. And then you find out that actually the person who's going to receive the pension credit hasn't returned the forms, hasn't instructed a financial planner, and then it ticks by and ticks by and ticks by.
Months go by, because they don't think it's any important because they think it's all happening behind the scene. They think, my lawyer's sorting it out, or someone's doing something for me, or the court's sorting it out.
And that can be a real problem if the person who's paying into the pension is still paying into it. Because we then come back to that percentage.
The other problem is that the person who's given the money away can't retire or take any benefits or do anything with their pension because the scheme know that they're going to be paying money out. They just don't know when because they haven't got all the paperwork. And so I've had some where the husband, for example, is really chasing and being quite nasty to the wife because they're saying, you need to take your money, but they haven't gone through that whole process because, say, they've sort of mentally checked out. And so the husband is putting pressure on the wife, for example. The wife has never had a pension before, she doesn't know where to invest it, so they starting from scratch, and that delays it. So that's why we always say try and get involved early because you can do some of that work alongside the work you're doing because you know roughly what the pension's worth. You've got a vague idea of what it's going to end up looking like. If it's £1 million and they're going to get £500,000, or if it's 50,000 they're going to get 25,000, you've got a ballpark to work with, and we can do some planning off the back of that. So I've got one at the moment where we started maybe 18 months ago. We've gone through the whole process and they've taken their time. They had a long time to think about it. We've gone backwards and forwards and then they've understood where they are. And then when they've got the final order and it's all been agreed, they said, well, you've done all the work for us. I understand where it's going to go. I understand what I can do with it. I understand what my income will be once I get that order in. And so they're quite happy because they've done it in a nice, calm manner in their own time. And another one I can think of exactly the same, but they came in right at the very end. They'd mentally checked out. And then the husband was chasing, the wife was getting agitated because she was feel like she was being really rushed into a decision. We were rushed, the solicitors were getting chased, everyone was sort of getting pushed to do stuff. because the wife had checked out and just didn't realise that she had to do anything. She thought it would all happen.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem, is getting involved early can make a big difference, because people can take their time and do it sensibly. If you all do it right at the very end, everyone just feels like they've been rushed into it. And then you get one person saying, well, I can't take my benefits until you take yours, and you haven't decided where you're taking yours. So, get on with it, sort of thing, and everyone then getting agitated.
So it's the important part, really, of having financial planners involved at the get-go, particularly with those valuable pensions. Sometimes, for perhaps the not so valuable pensions, it's the sense check. Do we actually need a pension on divorce expert report? And then for those where we're clearly going to have one, it's making sure, I will always identify to my clients, if I think they're going to need to have a pension sharing order, you need to have a financial planner on, because you're going to need some advice on where to take this money.
What to actually do with it. Yeah, and
absolutely. That's critical.
You don't always need it. Sometimes we have a chat with people. You don't always need it. So, for example, if they're a teacher in NHS, so the difference is some schemes you can only become a shadow member. So if it's a public sector, generally, most public sector, because it's taxpayers' money effectively, and they're not giving out any money, you're just getting an income in retirement. So if your other half is a teacher or an NHS worker, you become a shadow member. So the person getting the money becomes a shadow member of that scheme. So then they divide it. So let's say it's 50-50. The person who's giving the money away loses 50% of their benefit. The person who's getting the money gets 50%, but they both become a shadow member of that. They both become members of that same scheme. So they don't really need advice, because they're just going to join that scheme anyway, and they'll just get half of what it is. It's when they can't join the scheme, and then they have to transfer out because the scheme says, we're not going to keep the money, you have to go somewhere else. Then that's really when they need advice as to what they're going to do with it going forward. And so we'll just try and find the most cost-effective option for them based on their age and their attitude to risk.
And that's actually a really good point. Looking at clients' priorities, which will be very different at different stages in their lives. A young couple may not be particularly bothered about retirement, but certainly when you get to my sort of age,
near retirement,
start to think about it a little bit more.
Yeah, that's right. Someone in their 40s or early 50s who can't take the benefits, they often just would say park it. So they'll say, we'll move it to a pension, we'll invest it, but you're not going to take it for 10 or 15 years because you're still working and you don't need the income. There's a big difference between someone who's in the late 50s and early 60s who maybe has given up work, maybe who hasn't got any income, or they're working part-time and they just haven't got enough income to get by. Then they need the income. So that's where we're doing a lot of work on things like annuities or income drawdown. So you're going to get some money. What do you want to do with it? How much money do you need? Will that buy enough income for your retirement? The ideal thing is, of course, if they can get more income than they actually need. So that's ideal, because you can say, well, actually, if you need 30,000 a year and your pension will buy you 40,000, then take the 30 and keep some of it back, and maybe you can leave that for your children or grandchildren, or tap into it in the future if you want nice holidays or go on a cruise or a new car or whatever. So it's understanding how old they are, what's their health like, what's their other income, what assets have they got, and then what does their sort of future look like, and understanding all that, and then what do you do with it? Yeah.
And I think what we're learning from this as we come to a conclusion today, Simon, is that pensions are not straightforward.
Yeah.
There's not a one size fits all.
No.
It's really important where there are pensions involved to have a financial planner involved pretty much from the get-go. You certainly need a lawyer to help you to navigate through the PODE
sort of
report
legal
and
stuff,
all the legal side of it. And that where I started from by saying really that, quite frankly, pensions can often be one of the most valuable assets of a marriage. People always think it's the house, don't they? But in a lot of cases, particularly for those later on in life, particularly for those with defined benefit schemes, it can often be the biggest asset and the biggest facilitator of a good retirement, which is, let's face it, what you guys want for your clients and what we ultimately want for ours.
Yeah, people want a nice retirement, don't they? You can't really earn any more money once you're retired. So
absolutely.
It becomes difficult, yeah.
Simon, you've been an absolute star. Thank you so much. I hope everyone's found that really useful, and no doubt we will continue our really good working relationship.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking me.